All right, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be looking at something pretty interesting, Joe. It's a presidential action, an executive order that was just signed last week. And it has to do with America's 250th birthday, which is coming up in 2026. So this isn't just any old birthday. This is a big one. And this executive order is all about how we're going to celebrate it. So there's some really fascinating parts of this order. We're going to be talking about the task force that's been assembled, the National Garden of American Heroes, all sorts of really cool stuff. But to break it all down for us, I've got...
Well, you're right. This isn't just any anniversary. A 250th anniversary or a semi-quincentennial is kind of a big deal for a country. It's a time for a nation to reflect on its past, its accomplishments and its struggles, and to think about the future. And this executive order, with its focus on celebrating American heroes and history, seems to be trying to do just that.
Yeah, it definitely feels like they're trying to set a grand stage for this celebration. And one of the first things that jumps out is this Task Force 250. Now, this isn't just some small committee we're talking about here. This thing is huge EE. They've got people from like every part of the government on this task force.
Yeah.
You've got the Secretaries of State, Treasury, Defense, Interior, even the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Arts are involved. It's like they invited the entire government to this party.
Well, and the fact that they included so many different departments and agencies, that kind of tells us they're planning a pretty diverse celebration. I mean, think about it for a second. The Department of Defense might focus on the military parts of American history, whereas the National Endowment for the Arts might highlight our cultural achievements. It seems like they're trying to show the full picture of what America is all about.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's not like they're just letting this task force run wild either.
Yeah.
The order very clearly states that the president and the vice president are going to be directly involved leading this whole thing. So they're definitely making this a top priority.
Absolutely. Having the president and vice president involved shows just how important this event is to them. It's not just for show. They're really trying to shape how America sees itself, both at home and on the world stage.
Okay, so we've got this big task force led by the president and the VP themselves. But then things get a little bit confusing because the order also mentions a separate semi-quincentennial commission. And now I'm a little lost. What exactly is this commission and how does it fit in with the task force? Is it like a committee inside a committee?
That's a good question. My guess is that this semi-quincentennial commission was probably set up earlier, maybe by Congress, to get things started for the celebration. So they've probably been working behind the scenes for a while now. And now this task force, which was created by the executive order, is coming in to actually put those plans into action. The executive order says that the task force's executive director has to work with this commission. So it'll be interesting to see how that actually works in practice.
Right. Because there's always a little bit of tension when you have multiple groups working on a project this big. Who's really calling the shots here? Whose vision is going to win out in the end?
Exactly. There's definitely going to have to be some negotiating and compromise. But I think the important thing is that this celebration isn't just some last-minute thing they threw together. A lot of planning and preparation has gone into this, which shows they're serious about making this a truly memorable event.
And speaking of memorable, there's one part of this executive order that everyone seems to be talking about. It's the National Garden of American Heroes. They're planning on adding 250 heroes to this garden, which sounds incredibly ambitious to me. So what's the story behind this garden, and how does it connect to the 250th anniversary?
Well, the idea for a National Garden of American Heroes actually came from an earlier executive order. It was issued a few years ago, and that order called for creating this garden to honor important Americans. But it faced a lot of opposition, and the project never really got off the ground. So this new executive order is reviving that idea and linking it directly to the 250th anniversary. The goal is to showcase a variety of people who have shaped American history and values.
So they're going all in on this garden idea. This executive order even updates the older one to make it clear that the garden needs to be finished as quickly as possible, which kind of shows a sense of urgency, right?
It does, and I think that urgency highlights a big challenge with this whole thing. It's not easy to choose 250 people to represent all of American history. So who gets to decide who deserves a spot in this national garden? What are the rules for choosing them? And how do you make sure that the final list reflects all the different sides of America's past?
Those are all great questions. Because, let's be honest, what we think of as a hero changes over time. What might have seemed heroic in the past could be viewed very differently today, and the other way around too. Plus, you have to think about all the different areas of American life: politics, science, art, activism. How do you represent all of those fairly?
You're absolutely right. Creating this garden isn't just about choosing names, it's about figuring out what it really means to be an American hero. And that's going to cause some pretty intense debates.
Yeah, for sure. And it's not just the selection process that could be controversial. The executive order also talks about another sensitive topic, protecting monuments from vandalism. Now, that might seem like a separate issue, but I think it ties in really well with the whole theme of celebrating American history. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a smart move to connect those two things
Yeah.
by emphasizing the need to protect monuments. The executive order is basically saying that respecting our history means protecting its physical symbols too.
Right. It's like they're saying we're going to honor our past, and that includes protecting the things that represent it.
And they're not just talking about this in a general way either. The order actually brings up specific examples of vandalism,
Yeah.
especially vandalism connected to pro-Hamas demonstrations. And this is where things get really interesting, because now they're bringing a very specific and potentially divisive issue into the conversation.
Yeah, bringing up the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, even indirectly in a celebration of American history, is definitely going to raise some eyebrows. It makes you wonder what message they're trying to send here.
It's definitely a bold move. On the surface, it seems like a statement about protecting American symbols and values from outside threats, but it also touches on a bigger debate about free speech versus national security. Where do we draw the line between allowing dissent and protecting things that are important to our country? That's a really tough question with no easy answers.
Definitely. And it's a question that feels especially relevant right now with all the political stuff going on.
Yeah.
But maybe before we go too deep into that, we should take a step back and look at the big picture. This executive order, with its emphasis on heroes, monuments, and history, it seems to be pushing a specific idea of what it means to be American.
It is, and that's where critical thinking is really important. As we dig into this order, we need to be aware of the story it's telling and ask ourselves whose stories are being told, whose voices are being amplified, and whose perspectives might be missing.
That's a really good point. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of a big celebration. But we can't forget those bigger questions. Who gets to define what American history is? And how does that definition shape how we understand ourselves as a nation?
Exactly. Those are the questions we should be asking. And as we look closer at this order, we're going to find more layers of complexity that will help us answer those questions more fully.
So let's keep digging. What other interesting details are hiding in this document?
Well, there's still a lot to unpack, like the specific plans for all the events and how they're going to pay for it all. But maybe the most fascinating part is how this executive order tries to balance celebrating the past with dealing with the present and shaping the future. It's a delicate balancing act, and it'll be really interesting to see how they handle it.
I'm all ears. Let's dive in.
One thing that stood out to me was the executive order mentions vandalism at the Treasury Department and some statues in Lafayette Square. These aren't just like random examples. They're specific incidents that really tie the idea of protecting monuments to things that are happening right now, which makes it feel much more real and urgent.
Yeah, that's true. Bringing up those specific events definitely makes people pay attention. It's not just about some old statue somewhere. It's about protecting symbols that are right here in our capital city. But I wonder if focusing on these particular acts of vandalism, especially the ones connected to pro-Hamas demonstrations, if that might actually make things more divisive.
That's a good point. By highlighting those specific incidents, the executive order could be seen as taking sides on a really complex issue. It might alienate people who support the Palestinian cause, or people who think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict shouldn't be part of a celebration of American history. It makes you think about who's being included and whether this celebration might be used to push certain political agendas.
It's a tough situation. On one hand, you want to protect national symbols and history. But on the other hand, you don't want to silence people who disagree or shut down debate. It's a real balancing act.
You're exactly right. And it kind of shows the challenge of remembering and celebrating any country's past. There are always different points of view, different ways of understanding events, and different opinions on who should be honored. A truly meaningful celebration needs to recognize this, even if it means talking about uncomfortable things.
So you're saying it can't just be all fireworks and parades.
Exactly. This celebration could be much more than just a feel-good patriotic event. It could start a conversation all across the country about what it means to be American in the 21st century. What values do we really care about? How has our understanding of history been shaped? And how do we connect our past to the present as we move towards the future?
Well, when you put it that way, this celebration sounds a lot more significant. It's not just about looking back. It's about looking forward and using our history to build a better future.
Right. It's about thinking critically, challenging our assumptions, and being open to different perspectives. And that's where it gets really interesting. This executive order, even though it focuses on celebrating heroes and history, it actually creates a space for a much broader and more thoughtful discussion.
For all the talk about big ideas and grand narratives,
Yeah.
this executive order actually gets into some pretty specific details in some parts. It's not just about abstract ideas. It also talks about the practical side of how this celebration is going to happen.
Yeah, you're right. It talks about deadlines, funding sources, even where the task force will be located. The Department of Defense, no less. Now, some people might think those details are boring, but I think they're actually important. They show the work that goes into turning a big vision into reality. It takes more than just good intentions. It takes planning, coordination, and execution.
It's like they're saying, we're not just talking about it, we're actually doing it. And by putting the task force under the Department of Defense, they're sending a message about how seriously they're taking this celebration. It's not just a cultural thing, it's a national priority.
And it raises some questions, too. Is it normal to put a celebratory task force under the Department of Defense? Does it mean they're going to focus more on the military side of American history? Or is it just a matter of logistics and resources? It's something to think about.
For sure. It's often those little details that tell you what people are really thinking and what's important to them. But speaking of details, there's one thing that caught my eye. The order says that Task Force 250 will end at the end of 2026, unless the president extends it. What do you think about that?
That's an interesting point. On the one hand, it sets a clear time frame for the task force, which helps them focus on the 250th anniversary celebration. But on the other hand, it makes you wonder, what happens after the celebration is over? Does the conversation about American identity and history just stop?
It would be a shame if all the excitement and energy from the celebration just disappeared. It could be so much more than just a one-time event.
Right, and maybe that's why they included the option to extend the task force. It could be a way to make sure that the conversations and projects that come out of this celebration continue even after 2026 and lead to real change.
I like that idea. It would turn the celebration from a temporary spectacle into something that could have a long-term impact.
Think about the possibilities. Educational programs, community discussions, new efforts to preserve our history, maybe even changes to our policies based on a better understanding of our past.
It's exciting to think about all the things that could happen, but let's be realistic, there are going to be challenges.
Oh, definitely. Dealing with the complexity of history, balancing different perspectives, finding the money, and keeping people interested, all of that will take careful planning and effort. But if it's done right, this celebration could be a really important moment for America.
It sounds like this is going to be a really meaningful celebration. A chance to reflect on the past, understand the present, and think about the future. But how do you actually do that for a whole nation? How do you make it impactful for everyone?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think the first step is realizing that there's no one right way to tell the story of American history. It's made up of so many different things. Successes and failures, progress and setbacks, times of unity and times of division. A real celebration needs to include all of that, both the good and the bad.
So you're saying we shouldn't try to hide the difficult parts of our history. We should actually talk about them. That seems pretty tough, especially when you're trying to create a positive atmosphere.
It is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. By facing the hard parts of our past, we can get a better understanding of who we are as a country, a more honest understanding. It helps us move past simple stories and deal with the real complexities of history.
It's like saying, let's not just celebrate the wins. Let's learn from the losses, too.
Exactly. And we have to remember that how we see history is always changing. What people thought was heroic in one time period might look different to us now. A good celebration should recognize that and encourage people to talk about how we understand and interpret the past.
Yeah, that makes sense. But it also makes planning this celebration even harder.
Yeah.
How do you create an environment where people can share different opinions and feel respected without things falling apart?
That's where good planning and execution come in. You need to create spaces for dialogue, make sure people are talking to each other respectfully, and make sure that different voices are represented at every level of the celebration, from the planning stages to the public events. It also means being willing to listen to people who see things differently than you do, even if you don't agree with them.
So this celebration could be more than just remembering the past. It could be a chance for the whole country to talk about who we are and where we want to go.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what it needs to be. And if we can do that, the effects of this celebration will last much longer than just 2026. It could change how we see ourselves as a nation for years to come.
That's a pretty amazing thought. But let's get back to this executive order for a minute. What are they actually doing to make sure this celebration is as good as it can be?
Well, one thing is that the task force itself is very diverse. It includes people from a lot of different government agencies and departments, which suggests that they're trying to include lots of different perspectives right from the start.
That's good to hear. But just having diverse representation isn't enough. How do we know that those different voices will actually be heard and considered?
You're right. The order doesn't really say how decisions will be made within the task force. So there's a chance that some people's views might not be heard. I think it's going to be really important to pay attention to what the task force is doing and to make sure they're making decisions in a fair and open way.
So we can't just sit back and assume everything will be okay. We have to stay involved and make sure this celebration lives up to what it's supposed to be.
Exactly. This is a chance for all of us to help shape how we understand American history and identity. Don't just watch what's happening. Get involved. Ask questions. Share your own ideas. And hold the people in charge accountable for making this celebration something that includes everyone and represents everything that America is.
I completely agree. As we finish up our deep dive into this executive order, I keep thinking about that one big question. How should America celebrate its 250th birthday? It's clear now that it's not just about having a party. It's a chance to think, to learn, to talk to each other, and to imagine a future that honors all the sacrifices and achievements of the people who came before us.
It's about recognizing that our history isn't just a bunch of statues and monuments. It's a living story that's still being written, and each of us has a part in writing the next chapter.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. With America's 250th anniversary coming up, how do you think we should balance celebrating the past with dealing with the present and shaping the future? It's a conversation that needs to happen. So keep thinking, keep asking questions, and keep the discussion going.